I can share it to my personal Facebook and my Facebook fan page. Oh, we're sharing. Are we sharing now? Okay.
Yeah, we're just popping on. It usually like lags a little bit, so I just like to get it all set up. And sometimes I'll introduce it 5 minutes early, and it's fine.
Works for me.
Yeah, so go ahead and I'll let you kind of share.
I see it. Great.
There we go. Mute myself. All right. So I will go ahead and just introduce you real quick.
Okay.
Welcome back to Ask a Scientist, everyone, with the Asheville Museum of Science. My name is Abby, and I'm an educator with the museum. And today we are welcoming Dr. David Shiffman. His research focused on ecology and the conservation of sharks. I can't say how do you say
chondrichthyans.
Chondrichthyans fish.
So that's sharks and their relatives.
Perfect. So he received his PhD from the University of Miami, studying ecosystem science and policy in 2016. And he was studying shark conservation, so their role in the environment, and kind of bringing policy solutions to attention. He was also a postdoctoral researcher at the Libra Aero postdoctoral, the conservation biology unit. And is that a program with science or Simon Fraser?
It's a Canada-wide program, and I was based at Simon Fraser for doing
Great. And advised by Dr. Nicholas Dolby and Dr. Scott Wallace. So go ahead and please send in your questions for Dr. David along the way, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Wonderful. Yeah, anything that anyone wants to know about sharks, anything that anyone wants to know about the ocean, or what it's like being a marine biologist, or what you can do to help the ocean, I'm happy to answer anything at all. I do an Ask Me Anything session every week on social media and have for 5 years. So I've heard just about everything. If you have a burning question that you've always wanted to know about sharks, I would love to answer that for you. But in the meantime, while we wait for some questions to roll in, I want to tell you a little bit about who I am and what I do and what methods I use to do it. So again, my name is Dr. David Shiffman. I live and work in the Washington, D.C. area. I am a remote postdoctoral fellow, which means I'm a scientist, but not a full professor, who works at Arizona State University. Arizona State University actually does have a campus here in Washington, D.C., but I am based at both. I look at not only the science of sharks and how they interact with the ocean and what they need, but also the policies, the laws, the rules that are used to protect them, and how science can help make better rules to protect species that are in trouble. So I'll tell you a little bit about what my typical day looks like, and the sorts of things that I might do. Right now, like everyone else, I'm just working from home until we wait for things to get safer and it to be safe to travel and go to work again. But a typical day as a marine conservation biologist, which is someone who studies not only science, but also policy and to protect animals. Sometimes I spend my day out on a boat catching sharks, like you see in the top two photos here. And we catch sharks using fishing gear. Very few marine biologists that I know use scuba diving as part of their research. We scuba dive because we love it and we do it for fun. And I've been scuba diving all over the world, but never for work. The actual research is closer to fishing than to scuba diving. And then when we catch a shark, we take a variety of scientific measurements from it. We take a variety of scientific samples from it, and we can analyze back in the lab. Sometimes we put a GPS tracker tag on the shark so we can follow it where it goes anywhere in the world. Sometimes we just put what's called a mark recapture tag on them. That's just a piece of plastic with a unique ID code and a phone number on it. So if someone else catches that shark, they'll see the code, they'll call us and say, hey, we caught shark number 7,154. Here's where we caught it. Here's how big it was. And we send them a t-shirt or something to thank them for their help. In terms of the biological samples we take, I work with shark blood, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what I do with that in a second. But all of the research that I work on is catch and release, minimally invasive, non-lethal work, which means we're trying not to hurt the sharks. We're trying to get this data so we can help protect the sharks. Do you have a question?
Yeah, please. I was just wondering, So how many sharks do you typically catch in one study?
Yeah,
Or mark anyway?
sure. So it varies. And in a typical day of shark fishing, you would know it varies based on what gear you're using. And there's a bunch of types of fishing gear that you can use to catch sharks. And some of them you'll catch a few very big sharks. Some of them you'll catch a lot of pretty small sharks. The most sharks I've ever caught in a day was 278. Most of them were smaller than my arm. The biggest shark I've ever caught was about 16 feet long, a tiger shark in the Bahamas. The smallest shark I've ever caught you could pick up with 2 fingers. So there's a big range, but a typical day with the most common fishing gear that I use with the projects I'm involved with now, 5 to 10 sharks would be pretty typical, usually 4, 5, 6 feet long. Yeah, so there's a bunch of different types of fishing gear that you can use, and they catch different sharks of different sizes, and depending on what you're trying to do, you would probably use a mix of those, but not all at the same time because it just gets overwhelming. Catching 278 small sharks, let me tell you, you're tired at the end of that day because the sharks don't want to be there, and they may be only 3 feet long, but they're all muscle. So yeah, it all depends on what you're trying to do. The species that you see in the photos at the top here in the upper left, that's a nurse shark. In the upper right, that's a lemon shark in the Florida Everglades. It's cut off a little, but the nurse shark you can see is in water, so it can breathe the whole time. The lemon shark, you can see a little bit of a water pump extending into its mouth. So while it's on the boat, it can breathe. Because sharks are fish, and they breathe oxygen from water passing over their gills. They're not mammals. They need to be in water to breathe.
Yeah, I was wondering what that was. I'm glad you brought that up. That's pretty cool. And then I was also wondering, there are obviously a lot of species of shark. Is there a specific shark you look at, or are you looking at the distribution of sharks, or what are some questions that you like to answer?
So it depends on what you're trying to do. There are a lot of shark scientists, and we all are working on pretty different problems. But there are over 550 species of sharks, and there is a new species of shark, skate, ray, or chimera. Those are the chondrichthyans you mentioned earlier. There's a new species of chondrichthyan fish discovered by scientists about every 2 weeks. So there's a lot left to be discovered, but now there's about 550 known species of sharks. I have personally seen 54 species. That includes for research, scuba diving for fun on vacation, and visiting aquariums. So I've seen a little more than 10% of the species of sharks that are out there, which is a lot. But there are people who have seen more. There are some that I would love to see that I haven't gotten a chance to yet, even though I've been looking. But the sort of work that I'm doing, I'm working on a few projects right now. One is just sort of understanding the whole South Florida species complex. And that means everything that's there and how it all interacts in the big food chain of South Florida. One of the species that I'm working on, we just got a National Geographic for this, is looking at baby hammerhead sharks and how they fit into the food chain and the ecosystems of South Florida. In the past, during my master's degree at the College of Charleston, I worked on sandbar sharks, which are a common coastal species. But species that have been included in papers I published on, I think there's 16 or 17. The ones that I've specifically focused on are hammerheads and sandbar sharks, but I've also done some other work helping other people with some other species. Mm-hmm.
We do have an additional question coming in from Troy, Michigan.
Grayson. Troy is a city, not a person. Carry on. Hi, friend from Troy.
Nice. And he is asking, should people be more afraid of sharks or sharks afraid of humans?
Yeah. So sharks are not a major threat to humans. So a lot of people are afraid of sharks. And as it turns out, sharks do occasionally hurt people, and that's always sad. And there was a news story earlier this year where a woman in Maine was killed by a great white shark. That woman was a friend of my mom's. So that's like super weird for me, because it's just an infinitesimally small likelihood of anyone being hurt by a shark, and that I have a connection to this person is weird. But in general, in a typical year, about 700,000 Americans are killed by heart attacks and heart disease, and 1 American is killed by a shark. In a typical year, hundreds of millions of humans go in the ocean, and 50 to 70, not 50 to 70 million, not 50 to 70,000, 50 to 70 are bitten. And of those, maybe 10 to 20 require more medical care than a Band-Aid. Accidents happen when people are severely injured or even killed, it's usually because a big shark bit them. And if you're bitten by a big shark, that's going to mess you up, unfortunately. But we believe it's a case of mistaken identity. If you've ever been in the ocean, there was a shark near you and it knew you were there, and it probably didn't bother you. So more people in a typical year are killed not paying attention while taking selfies and falling off cliffs than are killed by sharks. More people in a typical year are killed by flower pots falling on their heads from above while walking down the street than are killed by sharks. So it's just not something you really need to worry about. And there's a lot of overblown fear about this that influences conservation and management policy in a way that's bad. Yeah.
And our 5th grade class is also wondering,
Awesome.
Are there any sharks that could live in freshwater, like the Great Lakes ecosystems? And if not, why do they need ocean water?
Yeah, so there are lots of sharks that live in freshwater. You hear on Shark Week all the time that the bull shark is the only species of shark that can enter freshwater. That's nonsense. They're not even the best at it. They're just the one that lives in the southeastern US that does it the most. Are there sharks in the Great Lakes? No. Are there sharks in rivers around the world? Yes. And there are bull sharks in Lake Nicaragua. There are lots of species of sharks that can temporarily enter freshwater. And there's a whole genus of sharks, your kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. There's a whole genus of sharks that lives primarily in rivers. The common name for them is the river sharks, very cleverly. But if you want to look them up, it's Glyphis, Glyphis, and they're super cool. Yeah. Are a bunch of questions starting to roll in?
Yes. So we have one from Charlotte that says, I follow you on Twitter and I was excited to see you coming to Amos's Ask a Scientist series. I was wondering, since sharks are, evolutionarily speaking, an old lineage, what are some of the key adaptations that have made them so successful?
Yeah, that's a great question. If there's a bunch of questions starting to roll in, I think I'll stop sharing my screen so we can just see me and you here a little more clearly. So sharks have been around a really long time. There were animals recognizable as sharks swimming in the ocean 100 million years before there were dinosaurs on land. Sharks have been swimming in the ocean before there were trees on land. So this is a really ancient group of animals. And though there are certainly some weirdos, weird features on extinct species that we don't see anymore, for the most part, the basic body plan is the same. You would look at one of these ancient animals and think that looks like a shark. It has the basic features. And from a natural selection pressure standpoint, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If something's working, if you're well adapted to an environment, there's not a whole lot of evolutionary pressure to change. Sharks tend to be faster than other species. They have incredibly powerful sensory systems, so they can find prey really well. And things like that. But yeah, sharks have been around a really long time. That doesn't mean every single species of shark that has ever existed still does. The problem is, from a conservation perspective, is that these sharks are really well adapted for an ocean ecosystem that's existed for millions of years, but doesn't exist anymore because of us. We are changing the ocean environment on a global scale, and that is leading to many species of sharks being endangered species. And that's the sort of work that I'm doing in the meantime.
That's a really great segue into the next two questions that we had. We had one that said, can you explain how climate change, specifically changing the acidity of the ocean, is affecting the sharks that you work with? And then kind of add on to that, what other effects of climate change are we seeing?
Yeah, so that's a great question with a disappointing answer. The sharks are in trouble. They are not in trouble because of climate change. There are lots of species that live in the ocean that are in very big trouble because of climate change. Coral reefs are in huge trouble because of climate change. Oysters and shelled organisms, their shells dissolve in acidified oceans, which is what happens as more carbon enters the atmosphere, more carbon enters the ocean, and it changes the pH. It makes the oceans more acidic. That's really bad for a lot of animals, including the scariest one for me is a group of plankton called pteropods. they're or sea angels, and they're the base of a lot of food chains, and they're dissolving. And you don't want the base of a food chain to dissolve. That's really bad for the entire food chain. But in terms of, is climate change a threat to sharks? For the most part, no. When sharks are big and can move, which means if the environment that they're living in is suddenly slightly too warm, they can just move 500 miles north, and then what used to be slightly too cold is now perfect. And we're actually starting to see that happen. Bull sharks are starting to use the North Carolina Outer Banks as a nursery area. We have data going back since the 1960s of shark surveys in the Outer Banks, and they never caught any baby bull sharks until about 2000, 2001, and now there's more and more of them every year. And that corresponds exactly with sea surface temperature rise. So there's some studies coming out saying that in super acidified oceans, sharks, it would mess with sharks' sense of smell, because smell is a chemical process, and changing the chemistry of the ocean changes how chemical processes work. There's a study recently that showed that it could dissolve shark scales. The problem with anything like this is time. Basically showing that an animal adapted for now is not adapted for the conditions 100 years from now doesn't necessarily mean what people think it does, because they'll have time to adapt somewhat in between now and then. But certainly there's alarming signs that if sharks don't adapt in time, there would be trouble. But generally speaking, the biggest threat to sharks is unsustainable overfishing, and that's so far ahead of every other threat that there's not really a number 2 threat to sharks.
Yeah, and our fifth graders are also wondering, have you seen in the last 10 years any sharks go extinct, and what is kind of the rate of extinction that we're seeing of sharks?
No. So many species of sharks are critically endangered, which means they could go extinct soon. Are there sharks that are extinct, or that we know of that are extinct? Yes, many of those were extinct before there were humans on the planet. Are there any sharks that have gone extinct recently? We don't know of any. There's, in fact, earlier this year, the first ever ocean fish of any kind that was alive in modern human times was declared extinct. That's called the smooth hand fish. I wrote an article about it for Scientific American in, I guess, April. So there's a lot of species that could go extinct if nothing is done. There's not a lot of species that are going extinct now, and what that means is there's still time to act.
And so what is the typical lifespan of a shark, and what is one of the oldest sharks that we know of?
Yeah. So again, there's over 550 species, so there's a huge range here. The whale shark, what's swimming behind me right now, 100, 120, 150 years. Great white shark, 70 to 100 years. A lot of species of sharks, 40, 50, 60 years. The longest lived shark is actually the longest lived vertebrate animal, and that's the Greenland shark. It's a deep sea Arctic species, and they can live to be over 400 years old. They're not considered reproductively mature adults able to have babies of their own until they're in their 160s. That's a long time to be going through puberty. And so there's a wide range, but generally we're talking approximately human lifespans.
And then if Raphael would like to know, if climate change is not as critical of a danger or as a factor as that we think it is, what does your policy work focus on?
So climate change is, just to clarify, climate change is a huge problem for a lot of things, just not for sharks. We should absolutely be working on addressing climate change, just not to protect sharks. They have other threats that are much, much larger. If we totally fix climate change but don't fix overfishing, sharks are screwed. If we totally fix overfishing but don't fix climate change, sharks are fine, but other things are in trouble. So my work focuses on trying to reduce overfishing pressure, which is when fishermen kill too many fish. My work tries to focus on promoting the recovery of species that have had their populations depleted, and that means trying to remove other threats from them. Once your population gets super low, then other threats become more of a factor. I've worked a lot with recreational fishing for sharks in Florida, and some of my graduate school work got the laws changed in Florida. You can read some, if you're curious to learn more about that, there's a paper about it on my website. we can share the link of in the comments on this Facebook page, but it's davidshiffmancv.com. And all of my peer-reviewed published papers and all of the media articles I've written or been interviewed in are linked there if you want to learn more about any of this.
And I was wondering a little bit about shark migration. So do they migrate similar to like something like a whale or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, lots of species do. Not all. Some, the nurse shark, one of the species that I showed in a photo up there, when I was sharing my screen earlier, I once went scuba diving on the same reef every day for a couple of weeks. There was a nurse shark under the same rock every day for a couple of weeks. So they are often considered the couch potatoes of the ocean. But there are certainly some species that migrate thousands and thousands of miles. That big tiger shark that I mentioned earlier that we caught in the Bahamas, we put a GPS satellite tracker on it and it swam up to Canada, and then it swam over to Portugal, and then it swam back to the Bahamas. So we're talking about the whole northern Atlantic Ocean is their migratory pathways. My PhD advisor calculated that their what's called home range is equivalent to the size of 1 billion football fields. So this is an animal that moves a lot, and it's hard to manage an animal that moves a lot. What that means is you don't just need to protect them when they're in the Bahamas. You also need to protect them when they're off the coast of Florida. You also need to protect them in Canada. You also need to protect them in Portuguese waters and everywhere in between. So highly migratory species are extra complicated to protect for that reason.
What about, we hear a lot about microplastics in the ocean now. Is there any research coming out about how microplastics are affecting our sharks?
Yeah, again, this is something that's a really big problem for a lot of animals. For fish, for sea turtles, for marine mammals, plastics are bad news. There is research showing that sharks are exposed to microplastics, but there's no research showing that it's a population level threat or a species level threat in the way that overfishing is. So we should absolutely work on resolving the problem and the threat from plastic pollution, but not because sharks need it. It's just not that big of a threat to them compared to everything else.
And do you think that has to do with the size of them, or do you think there's a certain reason that sharks are maybe less affected by that?
It's less of an issue, less affected by that, and more that they're super duper affected by overfishing. That it would be just really, it would just be really hard to have anything else be at that level of threat. But certainly lots of species of sharks have been found with plastic in their stomachs, but they're not dead because of that. I imagine that reduces their quality of life. It gives them less energy to migrate, less energy to grow, less energy to reproduce. And over the course of decades, that's bad news. But unsustainable overfishing is a big problem now.
And so what kind of policy changes or rule changes have we had over the last few years that have been directed a little bit or influenced by this type of research?
Yeah, so basically the US is pretty good at fisheries management, at making sure that our fisheries are sustainable and well managed. And that's been the case for sharks since 1994, 1995. Populations have started to recover after a new strong management framework came into place. There are certainly some species that are endangered species and need extra help. There are some, we're always changing management regulations here or there, but for the most part, the US does this pretty well. And a lot of effort is focusing on exporting those models internationally, making other countries do what we do so their fisheries are better managed. But there are also some endangered species here that do need extra attention and changes.
And then we have, so these, we've heard that sharks are partially blind. Is that true? And if so, how do they hunt for their food?
That is not true. Sharks have excellent eyesight for the most part. Deep sea sharks, it's different because there's no light there. So there's no reason to have good eyesight. But for the most species of sharks have very good eyesight. They tend to be colorblind or partially colorblind, but that's not the same thing as partially blind. They can see better than you can in clear water. They can see better than you can in murky water. They can see better than you can in low light. So yeah, a good question. But yeah, they tend to be colorblind, but some species may be able to see colors that we can't into the ultraviolet range.
That was my next question. I was going to ask where they were on the spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum they were.
And so there are some species of coral reef fish that look just sort of boring and brown to us, but if you look at them With ultraviolet film, you see these beautiful patterns that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. Sharks can see those and we can't.
Yeah, National Geographic, actually, I saw an article that it was a similar type of thing with bees. Bees see flowers so much differently than we see flowers.
Isn't that wild?
And
And
the
it
pictures
just
are crazy.
crazy.
Yeah.
And everyone just thinks that, the way that humans do it is the normal way, but there's a lot of other animals in the world that do things a lot of different ways, and some of them a lot more successfully for longer than we have.
And so Charlotte's wondering, what makes a shark a shark? What are some of the key traits and characteristics that separate them from other large predatory fishes?
Yeah. So sharks and their relatives, the skates, the rays, and the chimeras, those are the chondrichthyans we mentioned earlier. They're different from the other groups of fishes, like a bass or a tuna or a goldfish. And the main difference is what their skeletons are made out of between those two groups. Those other animals, their skeletons are made of bone. They're called the osteichthyes, or bony fishes. And your skeleton's made out of bone. Everyone who's watching, take your arm, find a point about halfway between your wrist and your elbow, and try to bend your arm. You can't. That's bone. Now crinkle your ear. That's cartilage. That's what shark skeletons are made out of. So the chondrichthyes, the sharks, the skates, the rays, and the chimeras, their skeletons are made out of cartilage, which is lighter than bone and heals faster and is more flexible, but it's not as strong. So that model doesn't work on land, and it doesn't work in certain situations, but in the water, for the most part, it's a adaptation that works really well. Not all sharks are top predators. Again, some sharks are pretty small when they're big, but all sharks are predators except for one. The bonnethead shark is an omnivore, which means it can also eat plants. But it doesn't just eat plants. It needs crabs and fish in its diet, but it can digest plants. And that's a relatively new discovery. So
no, sharks don't have bones, really. They have cartilage. Wow. Okay. Another really cool fact that we learned from Carly, who was another speaker with us, told us that sharks have teeth for skin. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So the scales that sharks have are called dermal denticles, which means skin teeth. And they basically have these little tooth-like structures all over their body, pointed backwards. Which means if you're ever at an aquarium and they have a shark touch tank and you do your little two-fingered touch. Do I have one of my plushies here? I have a model. You're doing your little two-fingered touch. You go head to tail, it's very smooth. If you go tail to head, it's sharp enough that it can cut your hand. And that's because they have all these backwards facing teeth. And that helps cut drag in the water. It helps make them move through the water with less turbulence and less resistance.
Interesting. Can you talk a little bit about shark reproductive cycles, brood size, and how often, in a lifespan they can reproduce?
So sharks are also different from most bony fish in that they have what's called internal fertilization. That means the babies are inside the mom. Whereas other fish spawn, that means they release eggs and sperm into the water and they meet outside and then become plankton and then grow up. So that means sharks have relatively few babies that are relatively more likely to survive to adulthood rather than spawning. Some types of sharks lay eggs. Some types of sharks have live birth, just like mammals. Some types of sharks have a weird mix of this that's only found in sharks and some kinds of snakes, where the baby hatches inside an egg, inside the mom, and then is born as if live birth. There's an entirely new method of reproducing via eggs that was just discovered a few weeks ago that I have an article coming out about in a couple of weeks. Sharks also have the ability to do what's called parthenogenesis, which is basically self-cloning. If a mommy shark wants to have babies and there's no dad around, she can just become pregnant. And rather than the babies being a mix of the DNA of the mom and the dad, they're exact genetic copies of the mom.
That is crazy. And it sounds, that's weird because two things you just said made me think of snakes. So snakes are also capable of doing the self-fertilization as a female. But also, I just learned this the other day. Apparently copperhead snakes do they lay their eggs inside them and then it hatches inside them, like you were just talking about with the shark. I've never heard of that. And now I know about it twice in a week. Well, that's weird. But that's great. And do the young ever stay with the mom?
No. Sharks don't have any parental care at all. Once the baby is born, it has to be able to take care of itself immediately. They have to be able to hunt and eat on their own and avoid predators on their own. And anything that they want to do, they may never see their mom again for the rest of their life. And they'll almost definitely never see their dad. The dad's not around after the mating event.
And so what are some of the, what are some weird behaviors that are kind of exclusive to sharks? Do they have any really specific ones?
So sharks have a sense that most other animals don't have. They can see and hear and taste and touch and smell, but they also have the ability to sense electric fields. And that's the science word for that organ is called the ampullae of Lorenzini. It's basically a electrosensitive jelly filled pores on their snout. If you look at a picture of a shark's face, it looks like they need to shave. They have just sort of stubble all over their face. And those are little pores that are filled with this jelly that reacts in the presence of electric fields. So what that means is if a shark is looking for prey and it's hiding under the sand where it can't see it or hear it or smell it, the shark still knows it's there because they can sense the electricity given off by its beating heart. They can also use that sense to navigate those big migrations that I was talking about earlier. In the middle of the ocean, there's no street signs, there's no landmarks. How do they know where they're going? They're following the Earth's magnetic field, the same way that sea turtles do, and some birds.
Can their, you called it, what was it called?
Electrosense.
Electrosense. Is that kind of comparable to something like echolocation that bats use, where it bounces kind of around and comes back?
Not really, because they're not generating something that leaves and bounces back. They're reacting passively to what's already there. It also doesn't work at as great a distance. So echolocation can work from pretty far away. This electrosense, we're talking inches. So that's why you see hammerheads sort of sweeping across the sand, the same way you might see someone at the beach with a metal detector sweeping across the sand. Yeah.
Is there anything special about like shark nerves? So they have really fast reflexes. A lot of fishies do. What is it that is giving them that sort of fast reflex?
They have a pretty complex nervous system, and their brains are pretty cool. They have basically, if you look at a shark brain, you'd recognize all the parts that you would see in a people brain, just organized differently. And you can actually tell. I have a colleague who studies the evolution of shark brains, and I have an interview with her coming out in Discover magazine in the spring. And so she does super cool stuff. But she can look at a shark brain and you not tell her what species it's from. And she, by looking at the brain, can say, this is a species that lives in murky water. This is a species that lives in cold water. This is a species that has to swim really fast, just by what parts of the brain are relatively big or small.
Wow.
Which is really neat. As far as the structure of their nerves, I'm just not sure, but they do have complex nervous systems.
What has been your most interesting interaction with sharks?
Yeah, I have just really loved the opportunity to study brand new newborn babies. That at that stage, the ones that are born live, they still have what's called an umbilical scar, basically a belly button. And you don't think of sharks as having that, but when they're brand newborn, they still have that for a few weeks. And just, you can hold a shark that size in your hand and know that when it grows up, it's going to be bigger than you. And that's pretty neat. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to interact with endangered rare species, especially hammerheads. They used to be extremely common. And it's super cool to get to see them, even though it's sad that they're not as common as they used to be.
Do you have a favorite fact about sharks yourself?
The Greenland shark one that I mentioned earlier, there's more about it. So these Greenland sharks that can live to be 400 years old, they eat polar bears and reindeer. So a polar bear is the biggest land predator in the world. They're bigger than lions, they're bigger than tigers, they're bigger than grizzly bears. And Greenland sharks have been found with polar bear skulls in their stomach. So we don't know if they're hunting them when the polar bears swim from ice floe to ice floe. They would certainly be vulnerable to attack from below at that point. But or if the polar bears drown and then the Greenland sharks scavenge them, all we know is polar bear skulls have been found in Greenland shark stomachs. And I think that's just bananas.
That is bananas. How much does a shark need to eat to stay alive? And how long can they go in between their eating sessions?
It depends on the species. The whale shark, that big guy that keeps swimming over my head, this is a video from the Georgia Aquarium's, I think it's called Pacific Voyager tank. They eat, I think it's 100, or it's something like 50 pounds of plankton a day. So they eat only these microscopic plankton. But also something like a great white shark, if they eat a big meal, they can go several weeks without eating again. Most species are eating something every day or every few days. Most sharks eat fish or crabs or shrimp. Some eat squid. Some eat octopuses. Some eat smaller sharks and rays. And there's only a few that can eat mammals. There's only a few that can eat sea turtles or seabirds.
And is that just because of availability, or their teeth?
Availability, size, how strong they are. I mean, if one is swimming behind me, you can see a few different species of sharks here, and some of them are too small to take on a bottlenose dolphin, but some of them are definitely not too small to take on a bottlenose dolphin. It's how fast they can swim, how strong they are, how big they are, how big their teeth are, things like that. Basically, all animals, there's something called optimal foraging theory. Basically means that all animals will go for the easiest meal, and they want to get the most energy while expending the least energy.
And this is a sort of weird how they look question. Is there a reason for swimming purposes why a shark's fin is kind of the vertical, like up and down, side to side thing, and a whale would be like I know a whale's a mammal and a shark's a fish, but
both ways work. Okay. There's different energy use associated with it. The sharks, you'll see on most of them, the top part of their fin is slightly longer than the bottom part, and that helps with lift. Sharks don't have swim bladders like other fish do, so that just helps sort of keep them upright in the water. And if sharks stop swimming, they sink. So there's some of it has to do with there, but basically side to side versus up and down, either way works. But you won't see sharks that go up and down. You won't see whales that go side to side, but there's not one that's better.
And we have one that says, do sharks really eat their young or relatives? Do they recognize their family at all?
So they would not recognize their family. It's certainly possible that they would eat their young or their relatives, but for the most part, they can recognize a member of their same species. And if there's another male available or another meal available, they would probably go for that. But certainly it happens.
So do they have any social behaviors with other sharks, really?
Some species do, most species don't. Especially younger animals, when they're too small to take care of themselves out in the big deep blue sea. They live in what's called nursery areas, which is where I've done some of my research, where I've gotten to see the baby sharks. And then you're more likely to find a bunch of baby sharks together than a bunch of adult sharks.
And Keely's wondering, you said that they'd likely never see their mom again, but if they did, would they know?
No.
Oh man, that's kind of sad. All right. And we don't have any questions as of right now. We answered all of them. So do you have anything else that you would like to share with us?
Just if anyone is wanting to learn more about sharks, or if you're watching this video later, or if I didn't get to your question otherwise, I am very active on social media and always happy to answer any questions that anyone has. It's at Why Sharks Matter on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
Yeah, I can go ahead and share all your handles too. Yeah.
And I also share on there every once in a while. We need your help. There's nothing at the moment, or I would bring it up, but several times a year, there's a particular policy issue where public support or public opposition will make a really big difference in making sure that the right policy is put in place. And I always share those and exactly how you can get involved on social media. So the best way to know how to help is to follow and check in regularly.
Do you have any advice for people that want to get involved, or are there any nonprofits that are worthy of supporting that deal with these types of issues?
Great questions. So the best my go-to shark conservation nonprofit is called Shark Advocates International. They're on Twitter and Facebook at Shark Advocates, and it's sharkadvocates.org. There are 78 environmental nonprofits that do at least some work on sharks. Shark Advocates International is the only one I can recommend unreservedly. Others do some stuff I really love and some stuff that I have reservations about. Some of them don't do anything I love. Shark Advocates International is a group that I can recommend wholeheartedly and unreservedly. And because it's a small group, your donations really go a long way.
Cool. Thanks for sharing that one. And I'll definitely make sure to get that website also attached in the comments. And I can't believe I almost forgot to ask you this. There is so much scrutiny and animosity between Shark Week and researchers have a lot to say about Shark Week.
Oh, yes.
I'd love to hear your take on Shark Week and what we should think about next time it comes on.
So I've been called Shark Week's biggest critic by the Tampa Bay Times. I am not a fan. I've watched every episode. I on social media, I provide detailed reviews and fact checking and commentary of every episode, showing what exactly is wrong and why that's bad. Shark Week is a dumpster fire of misinformation. It is the biggest stage in the world for marine biology or ocean science. And if they even lifted one little finger to try and do the right thing, they could do so much good for public education. And they just don't try. It's not just, they used to make up stuff, like entirely fictional shows with actors playing scientists and actors playing shark bite victims and CGI video of sharks. They don't do that anymore, which doesn't mean they won't start again. But now it's more just laziness and saying, we're the only people ever to look at this problem. No, you're not. This is the biggest shark conservation issue in the world. No, it isn't. If everyone did this, it would help save the ocean. No, it wouldn't. This species of shark can get this big. No, it can't. Just stuff that I knew was wrong when I was 8, and probably several of the people watching here know is wrong. It is an unreliable source of information. They occasionally feature real experts. More often than not, they feature charlatans and snake oil salesmen who are not real experts and claim to be, and take spotlight and resources away from real people who are really trying to do the right thing. Shark Week is a problem.
Can we implement policy to get Shark Week out of here, or change it, modify it?
I would love to see it changed rather than disposed of, because it is such a huge platform. Mm-hmm. And I have written extensively about things that they could do to help. That involves firing about half of the production team and keeping them away from cameras and TV forever, as they are spreading misinformation. I had a rant about this that went viral in August, that you can't necessarily draw a straight line between Shark Week saying, actually, the megalodon shark is not extinct, and scientists in the government know that and are lying to you, don't trust them, and people being paranoid about COVID-19 conspiracy theories. But certainly it's the same type of problem, and Shark Week and the Discovery Channel have profited from muddying the waters about trusting scientists. Mm-hmm. And that's bad. But if I created a new thing, a new media startup, and it was wildly successful in the top 0.1% of new media startups, it would still reach 1% the audience that Shark Week does. So if we can get Shark Week to become 10% better, that's better than me creating a new media startup.
Nice. But it sounds like you've definitely thought about it a lot.
Yes.
And then we do have a couple of more questions. We have,
Great.
If you could bring back any extinct shark species, which one would you bring back and why?
I have a book about it here. You see the crazy face on that guy? It's called the Helicoprion. Helicoprion. It's actually not a shark. It's a chimera, a shark relative. But they have like a rotating buzzsaw in their lower jaw. And we have no idea what that was for. And I would sure love to see a live one and understand what it's for.
What sort of evidence was there to say it was like a rotating?
Well, the jaw is fossilized. We have fossils of this rotating buzzsaw. And yeah.
That's really cool.
But we have no idea. We've never seen one used in a live animal. And that's, oftentimes with paleontology, you see a structure in an extinct animal and you think, oh, that's similar to this thing in an elephant. So it maybe did that. This is something that's never been seen in anything else, just a rotating food processing organ. And I would love to know what the heck it was used for. Yeah. And the only way to do that would be to see a live one.
I agree. I want that. I don't know enough about other shark species, but I want that one to come back too.
Yeah, they're so cool.
And then this is a really great question. What are shark teeth made of, and how do they constantly grow back, or do they constantly grow back, after they're lost?
Yeah, so they're made of cartilage and calcium and the chemical stuff gets tricky, complicated, but similar stuff to what similar stuff to what your teeth is made out of. I had an article in I write a column for Scuba Diving Magazine, and I had an article recently about whale shark teeth and scales, and it has a description with photos of what that looks like if people want to take a look. But they do regrow teeth constantly their whole lives, and that's because sharks can't go to the dentist, and sharks don't have hands. So when they're trying to eat food, they can't hold a fork and knife and cut it into bite-sized chunks. They need to be able to bite and tear and shred it. And if they lose teeth, that means they can't eat and they die. So sharks are constantly regrowing teeth their whole lives, and that will lead to that means they go through literally thousands of teeth in their lifetime for some species.
Do most shark species have those rows of teeth that we think about with sharks?
Many do. Some have more crushing plates, like a nurse shark. They have teeth, but they don't tear. They crush shells and things like that. But those do break and the new pieces rotate in.
And how do sharks, like basking sharks, filter out the water when they're eating tiny food? Is it plankton? And does it just go out of their gills?
Yeah. So they are the whale shark, which keeps swimming behind me, and the basking shark are the first and second biggest fish in the world. They are like the great whales. They are filter feeders. That means they are sucking in enormous amounts of water and filtering out the good stuff, which is plankton, tiny little fish and shrimp and crabs and things like that. And yeah, the rest of the water just goes out the gills. There's a little tiny filter inside the mouth.
All right. And so that wraps up our questions that have come into the chat box. And I don't want to take up too much time of your morning. This was a really great talk. Do you have any last things that you want to add for us?
Nope, I think we covered just about anything. Thanks for having me. I hope everyone's staying safe and healthy and sane. And if your other questions come up, you can find me on social media at Why Sharks Matter.
I will absolutely get any follow-up questions to you. I always chase people down for that.
Awesome.
And thank you so much for filling in. I do wish Dr. Fernanda Santos, who was going to be our speaker, the very best with her field work. She's leading a field project right now that is just
gets to leave the house. I'm so jealous.
I think it's kind of one of those soul crushing moments in the research, though. So I'm wishing her the very best. And I want to thank you so much for stepping in.
Absolutely.
And I also do want to let our viewers know that we will be having reruns for the next 3 weeks of Ask a Scientist because I am getting married. So look out for that. But then we will be back with new speakers when I return in 3 weeks. And thank you again, Dr. David Shiffman. I will add all of Dr. Dave's information into the comment section here. So if you guys are interested in anything that he was talking about today, following him, any of the nonprofit organizations, you will have access to all of that. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Have a great afternoon. Bye, everyone.